You all for being here. I'm Gene Healy, Senior Vice President for Policy at the Cato Institute, and we're very pleased to welcome Vivek Ramaswamy to Cato today for a conversation on reining in the administrative state. Some biographical details. He was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he's had a wide-ranging career in business as an author and lately in politics. He's not just an advocate of capitalism, but a successful practitioner. He founded several successful businesses, including Roivant Sciences, Strive, and Chapter. His books include Woke Incorporated, Nation of Victims, Capitalist Punishment, and a soon-to-be-released Truths, The Future of America First. But many of you probably know him best from his 2024 run for the Republican presidential nomination. Reason magazine called him easily the boldest voice for slashing government during the Republican primaries this year, which ordinarily could read as sort of a backhanded compliment, best complexion award at the leper colony. But in this case, I don't think it was meant that way. As a candidate, Vivek ran on shutting down multiple government agencies, including the Department of Education, the FBI, the ATF, and the Department of Commerce, and released detailed plans for taking a meat axe to the administrative state, cutting regulatory headcount by some 75%. He's also been a vigorous internal critic of the Republican Party. In fact, earlier this summer, he told the Libertarian Party convention, quote, "I have voted as many times for a Libertarian for U.S. president as I have for a Republican." I have an even purer record. If I recall correctly, all my votes for president have been for the LP ticket, for all the good that's done me. Vivek has also been a key player in a very important debate on the right that we've been watching from the outside at Cato. There's this emerging view pushed by the increasingly influential national conservatives that says, instead of dismantling the regulatory state, let's think about how we could get this ring of power to work for us. He has taken the opposite side of that debate. As he put it at a recent National Conservative Conference, "I don't care to replace a left-wing nanny state with a right-wing nanny state." So please join me in welcoming Vivek Ramaswamy.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's great to be at the Cato Institute amongst friends, and it's good to be in an atmosphere in an election year where so much of the public discourse is focused on what are, in the scheme of things, relatively parochial issues, one candidate versus another, to be able to take a step back in the middle of a heated, contested election and think about the realm of the why we're going through the motions in the first place in either political party. And I'll kick this off with a reflection on risks, actually. I'll tell you about two risks and trade-offs we're going to be required to make in our discourse and in the future direction of the country. I am a capitalist by background. I don't apologize for that. I think capitalism is the best known system to mankind to lift people up from poverty. I think both political parties, frankly, have become apologists for that vision. But speaking as a capitalist, now in the marketplace of ideas, you're always going to have to take some kind of risk in return for a reward. The first is in the area of political discourse. I think there's two risks you could take. I come off of a presidential campaign that I ran with the distance of about 7 months ago that I wrapped it up. There's one risk where you say too much, that you too often share what your actual opinions are. There's a risk in that. Could actually distract you from the core message that the media takes away from what you have to say. That's one risk, is you say too much, you offend some people along the way. The other risk is that you actually fail to say enough by self-censoring yourself. There's no magic answer here. There's no Goldilocks solution to say you're going to get it exactly right as a candidate. The only question is, what risk are you willing to take? And I think right now we live in a moment in American politics where I worry less about the risk that most in the media say they're worried about of a president, that you say too much, that you might offend some people. I think the greater risk is that we're not saying enough of what we actually believe. Now, this relates to our discussion about shutting down the administrative state. Again, here you face two possibilities of risks you can take. One risk is that you don't cut enough. You have an 8-headed hydra, you cut off one of its heads, it grows right back. The other answer isn't that you're going to cut the exact, precise, correct amount. You're going to take a risk in the other direction. The risk is that you cut too much. You might cut so much fat that you also cut some muscle along the way. You have to acknowledge that's a risk too. But again, I think that's the risk that we now have to be willing to take. And so in the discussion we're about to have, I'd encourage you to think about it through a risk-reward framework. Nothing I'm about to tell you comes without its costs. Every decision has its trade-offs. But the question is, which trade-offs are we actually ready and willing to make in the best interests of our country in the next step of our national journey? Now, we've all heard in the news in recent weeks that presidential candidate Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, has proposed something resembling price controls in the market for groceries. It's an interesting market to apply this to when you look at the price margin, the profit margins of less than 2% for major supermarket chains. But this was a major measure of controlling inflation through combating it via price controls. And you heard a lot of Republicans railing against this, that this is going to result, every economist would tell you, in supply shortages, it would result in black markets, and eventually in exacerbating the very inflation that it was designed to combat. Fair enough. But I believe this is actually just a symptom. What makes this policy proposal so concerning is that it is part of a broader pattern of socialist, anti-capitalist price control measures in other areas of the economy as well. I'll give you a couple examples to kick this off. One is a recently proposed bill that's being considered in the Senate Banking Committee right now to apply a different type of price control, an 18% maximum for the interest rate on credit cards, when, by the way, the average APR on a credit card right now is in excess of 25%. This would result in shortages in access to credit. It would result in black markets, people accessing credit in a different manner, and ultimately increasing the cost of capital anyhow. We've seen proposals, again, legislatively being weighed in the Senate and the House for raising the federal minimum wage. Again, something that would require and necessitate a shortage of workers, a shrinkage in the economy as a consequence. But in the latter two cases, the dirty little secret is that those two proposals were actually advanced not by Democrats, but were championed by Republicans. So I do believe that right now we do face a current in favor of economic socialist policies. But the reality is it's a bipartisan consensus in the direction of that new socialism in America. And I think if we see this as a partisan issue or a partisan red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat question, we miss the point. Before I get into the substance of my vision for taming the administrative state and why that's important, I'll say a word about why I think Donald Trump was such an interesting and fascinating political figure when he arrived on the scene in 2016. The thing that made Donald Trump, I think, a unique leader was that he actually bucked the consensus of the then existent Republican Party. Whether or not you agree with the content of it, he was a presidential candidate who was the first in his party to openly oppose the Iraq War and the historical direction of foreign policy in the Republican Party, rejecting foreign interventionism in favor of American interests. Somebody who believed that the goal of trade policy should not necessarily be to just maximize the size of the economic pie, but should be to look after the interests of American manufacturers and workers. And the same goes for immigration policy. Say what you will about whether or not you agree with the content of those policies. It's something that bucked the historical Republican consensus. What I see now traveling the country is that what began as a challenge to the system has now become a new system in the conservative movement. You have up and down ballot candidates across the Republican Party saying things to the effect of, we believe in making more things here. We believe in being the party of workers. We believe in putting America first, but without interrogating what these phrases actually mean or why we're saying them. And I personally believe that's not a good development for any movement when you start to recite your slogans by muscle memory rather than remembering the why of why we believe what we do. So as I trace the intellectual development of the conservative movement for the last half century or so, certainly over the last 20 to 30 years. I'm going to give you three phases. The first is what preceded us, the second is the one we're in, and the third is where I believe we're headed. What we've turned the chapter on is the blithe neoliberalism of yesterday. This is what Donald Trump and the rise of the America First movement was a response to. The neoliberal consensus was that somehow we were going to use capitalism as a vehicle to spread democracy around the world. That we were going to export Big Macs and Happy Meals, and somehow that was going to export capitalism to places like China. That hasn't worked out as planned. It has increased U.S. dependence on China for our modern way of life. It's increased U.S. dependence on China for our own military industrial base, for our own pharmaceutical supply chain. And even Friedrich von Hayek, in a careful reading of The Road to Serfdom, would teach that a nation cannot depend on its adversaries for its own national self-defense. Furthermore, it's created a false moral equivalence between the United States and China. As China increases the demands it makes on companies to enter the Chinese market, to criticize the United States while staying silent about the CCP. That's how you get to BlackRock or Nike or Airbnb or JP Morgan Chase, issuing social proclamations against the United States of America or American practices while staying silent about true human rights atrocities in places like China. And it's also it's created a imbalance in the application of, say, climate emissions standards in the United States versus China. So these are examples of the way in which the blind global neoliberalism of yesterday has failed to really deliver on its own vision of providing for the autonomy of the United States. Now, in response to that, we've seen a wave of protectionist backlash. In the last 10 years, much of the direction of the conservative movement has said that because we ultimately were left holding the bag from threats to our security, all the way to even threats to our national identity arising from unfettered legal and illegal immigration, unfettered reliance on trade with partners like China. We're going to react to that and say, no. The new direction of the conservative movement is going to be to protect American workers and manufacturers as our main objective. Now, here the policies are interesting. This is where we've seen the rise of tariffs, not just with respect to China, but with respect to other trading partners as well. But the irony is, if we're really serious about achieving the goal of no longer relying on China for our military-industrial base, that would actually mean more, not less trade, with allied nations like Japan or South Korea or India or the Philippines. And it's also led to a reaction that frames our immigration policy in terms of how we protect American workers from the effects of foreign wage competition. So that's the protectionist era that was a response to the neoliberal era of yesterday. What I believe represents the next stage in the evolution of our conservative movement, the future direction of not only the America First movement, but the conservative movement, is one that puts sovereignty at its center. Neither the neoliberalism of yesterday, the materialism of economic value maximization only, nor the materialism of protectionism in protecting the interests of a narrow set of American stakeholders, of workers and manufacturers. But instead to say the thing that really matters to us as Americans is to regain our sovereignty both as individuals and as a nation. And that's what leads to the doorstep of that's what's at stake in this discussion about the administrative state. This is really about regaining the sovereignty of our citizenry. Our founding fathers fought a revolution in 1776. And their vision was to create a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. That means that the people who we elect to run the government ought to be the ones who actually run the government. And today, the state of affairs that obtains in the United States, that's not the America we live in today. If Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and George Washington were walking the streets of Washington, D.C. today, they would find it unrecognizable relative to the constitutional republic that they set into motion. Most laws are really not laws anymore made through the branches of through the congressional lawmaking process. They are rules written by bureaucrats in three-letter agencies who were never elected to their positions, but are writing fiats that effectively have the binding force of the rule of law. I believe this is the central cancer at the heart of the American soul today. I believe that this is the greatest threat to our own sovereignty, not some threat abroad, but a threat that begins right here at home. The people we elect to run the government are no longer the ones who actually run the government. Now, the good news is we live in an era where we have had an unprecedented opportunity to actually take that on in the wake of Supreme Court decisions that have come on from on high in the last 3 years, starting from West Virginia versus EPA in 2022, to SEC versus bureaucracy this year, to Loper versus Raimondo this year, which collectively have paved the path to actually shut down that fourth branch of government. West Virginia versus EPA a couple of years ago effectively said that any rule that is written by an unelected bureaucrat that pertains to a major policy question, a major questions doctrine, if it's a major policy question, it's unconstitutional unless it was actually passed through the constitutionally ordained process of lawmaking. Loper versus Raimondo similarly held that the deference paid to those administrative agencies' understanding of the law, a standard in constitutional law previously known as Chevron deference, is now overturned. And SEC versus bureaucracy, which just came down this cycle as well, said that the historical practice of administrative law judges serving as judges within their own agencies is now unconstitutional as well. So right now we have a seismic opportunity that, frankly, even President Trump did not have in 2016 or 2017 when he began his first term. And that is to ultimately take not a chisel but a chainsaw to that administrative state. And the question is whether we're actually up for that challenge or not. The temptation in the conservative movement today is to say that, you know what, once we take over, we don't just want to shut down the administrative state, we want to reconstitute it to advance our own objectives. Take that bill that I mentioned earlier, capping credit card interest rates. That's a bill that would empower the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, to enforce that law when this is exactly the agency that's now asking small business owners across the country for their race, their gender, or their sexual orientation of their employee workforce and makeup as a basis for deciding how they apply their regulations. And the question for us to confront is, do we as a conservative movement want to hand over greater authority to those same agencies, or do we want to get in there and actually shut them down? This is, I think, the dividing line for the future direction of the America First movement. We will face the temptation to say that we want to go into the Department of Education and redirect federal funding away from the four-year college degree programs that have been assailed for their cost inflation over the last decade and say we need to subsidize instead two-year college degrees or vocational programs. But I think the right answer is not only to get in there and reform the Department of Education, but to get in there and actually shut it down. We'll face the same question with respect to the Department of Labor. Do we believe we need to raise the federal minimum wage, or do we need to actually get in there and shut most of it down, leaving it to the market to decide what wages are or are not paid in the marketplace for products and services? So this is the defining question for the future of our own movement is, do we believe in reconstituting that left-wing nanny state with a right-wing alternative, or do we believe in actually once and for all dismantling the project that Woodrow Wilson began, the one that Lyndon Johnson and FDR allowed to metastasize? Republican presidents like Richard Nixon on down have continued to expand and build upon. Or do we want to start with a new edifice? There's going to be risks that we take along the way. Shutting down the Department of Education will not be without its inconveniences along the way. The question for us over the next 4, 8, 12 years is, are we ready to bear the consequences of those inconveniences? You can make a sacrifice when you know what you're sacrificing for. And in this case, it's for the constitutional republic that our founding fathers set into motion that has 3 branches of government, not 4. And I do think that it's an easy subject conservatives have discussed for a long time. There's a reason we haven't actually done much about it, because in the short run, the temptation will always be to vote in the direction of the nanny state. There's 2 types of nanny states. One is the entitlement state. That's what we usually have in mind when we talk about a nanny state. But the second, and I think more solvable component of the nanny state is that modern regulatory state. That regulatory state, in many ways, substitutes for lawmaking because it lets the congressman off the hook. It lets the senators off the hook because they no longer have to bear accountability for the laws they actually pass. But the question for us is, are we actually willing to restore accountability in the elected lawmakers that our founding fathers envisioned as the people who actually made the laws in this country? And if we do, I think we regain our sovereignty. If we don't, then I believe that we will go the way of pre-1776 England, the beginning of an elegant decay and the beginning of the end of what our founding fathers unleashed as our American experiment. So that's a discussion we're about to have, is to dive into the details of exactly how we're going to shut down that administrative state, exactly what the mechanics of that might look like, and what's at stake for our American identity on the other side. So thank you for the warm welcome. Looking forward to a lengthy discussion, and we hope to get some great questions from those of you in the audience as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to flesh out a little bit what you've called this quietly brewing rift on the right. Looking at it from outside the conservative movement at Cato, it seems as though there's been a fetishization of state power growing among the national conservatives. The view that state power is a legitimate weapon, administrative power is a legitimate weapon for punishing woke corporations and waging a cultural counter-revolution against the left. And some of the quotes you see from NatCon conferences put you in mind of, you hear things about rewarding friends and punishing enemies, humiliating the institutional centers of power of the left, and they kind of put you in mind of Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan, crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. How are you doing in this debate? Because it seems to me that you've described it as a temptation, and it seems to me that there's a growing trend that this is, using the Conan view is like the more based view or something. And, you've even seen the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party, J.D. Vance, has made sounds in this direction that he said a couple of years ago, a lot of conservatives have said we should deconstruct the administrative state, and I'm sympathetic to that project. But another option is that we should just seize the administrative state for our own purposes. So how do you perceive you're doing in this internal debate? I mean, you're definitely getting a hearing, but are you making headway, and how do you know? Yeah,
not well enough yet, is what I will say, because I give you evidence for that. I ran for U.S. president, and I failed to achieve the goal that I set out to achieve. But I think there's a lot of reasons behind that and a lot of learnings that I'll take with me for the future. I do think that take someone like J.D. Vance. I got to say something I respect about him. He's a friend. We went to law school together. And at least he has an ideology. I think part of what we're missing in Washington, D.C. is I wish our politicians were more ideological, actually. The press uses the word ideological as a pejorative. I use it as a compliment. Now, we don't see eye to eye on some elements of that ideology. And I think that's a good thing. That makes, for example, the Republican Party in the country stronger when we're able to have that open debate. Take an example. We're going to get a spicy example right here. I met a gentleman who was a Japanese immigrant on the way in. It reminded me of an example that's been in the news in recent months. Right? Take the calls for intervention in the acquisition or the pending acquisition of U.S. Steel by Nippon Steel. It's hard to believe that if that company were called anything other than U.S. Steel, that there would be this level of call for intervention in that acquisition. But the question for us is, do we want to actually expand the scope of power of the FTC under Lina Khan or whoever leads it next to be able to make the decisions of what does or doesn't count as fair competition, or don't we? Either you trust the FTC with that or you don't. Remember that many of the Republicans' critiques of Kamala Harris this last week was that her decision would give the FTC the authority to decide what did or didn't count as price gouging in the marketplace for groceries. This is idiotic policy. It's not something that you want a three-letter bureaucrat with politicized motivations making the decision on. But if Republicans are going to decry that decision, we can't expect that same FTC to perform any better if we're really empowering that same organization to make, relatively speaking, those same arbitrary decisions. And the way I might explain this to a conservative who, I share conservative goals, but a conservative who says, no, the right way to do this is actually to use muscular state intervention to achieve our goals, or else we're never going to get there, would be this, to use the case of U.S. Steel. Anybody in the room actually know who the top shareholders are of U.S. Steel? BlackRock. BlackRock is the top shareholder of U.S. Steel. It's a top shareholder along with Vanguard. The very institutions that have advanced so-called environmental, social, and governance agendas through their proxy voting power in American corporations. So I do find it to be a bit of a mystery that it would be a nominally conservative call for the U.S. government to intervene on behalf of BlackRock to remain the largest shareholder of an American corporation on the question of BlackRock. So this is an organization that has voted for Scope 3 emissions caps at U.S. companies like Chevron, while failing to vote for those same emissions caps while they remain shareholders of places like PetroChina, advancing the very climate agenda that you saw so artfully displayed on the stage just a few moments ago. Yet the irony and the dilemma for a conservative movement is now we're going to call on the U.S. government and the FTC, a three-letter agency, to intervene so folks like the ones you saw on the stage right now can be calling the shots in American companies' boardrooms. That doesn't make any sense even on the substance of advancing a conservative agenda. So my view is any time that you're going to expand the scope of a three-letter agency, what you're actually doing is you're digging the grave that you're going to fall into tomorrow, right? They're selling you the rope they're going to use to hang you tomorrow. I think that's what it comes down to with the administrative state. And it's a different vision from the temptation to say that, you know what, once we have the levers of power, let's use it to advance our own substantive ends. The reality is, I think that road ends in the ultimate view of a government-controlled society that's exactly the opposite of what the conservative movement stands for today.
Well, a related question, I was going to ask you, if you're coming at it from another angle, if you're on the left and sane and willing to listen, unlike the folks who are just here, let's say you're someone who doesn't believe that government is best, which governs least, and that maybe you take on board some of this critique that most of the law that's being made today is not being made by it's being made by people that nobody elected. But if you have a lot that you want government to do, what do you say to somebody who just doesn't see how you can get the activist government that they want through the ordinary legislative process? Is there anything to say to them other than, you should have different priorities?
Convince the voters. That's the answer. And the commitment that I make is, look, I live in this country whether or not the people I agree with. I'm a citizen of this country, and I will pledge allegiance to this country, regardless of whether the guy I vote for is the guy who's in charge, regardless of whether the party of which I'm a member is the one that governs in both branches of Congress. But it should at least be the people who we elect to run the government that should actually make those rules, rather than back agency bureaucrats and three-letter agencies that were never vested with that authority in the first place. That's why we fought an American Revolution, actually. The interesting thing to know about the administrative state is I think it is just a vestige. It is the modern avatar of pre-revolutionary America under England and King George. The old view was that we, the people, could not be trusted to self-govern, right? That we, the people, had to be overseen by the enlightened elite on questions ranging from climate change to racial injustice, that we couldn't be trusted to do this ourselves. But the idea that every person's voice and vote counts equally, that you're able to speak your mind openly as long as I'm able to in return, those were radical ideals at the heart of the American founding. But that is what made America great the first time around. And so if we agree on anything, we might disagree from contentious questions from abortion policy to climate policy to healthcare policy, so be it. Let's vigorously have that debate, but let it at least be the people who we actually elect to make those decisions be the ones who actually do it. And I think if there's one basic idea that unites all Americans, it's that. It's that we believe in every person's voice and vote counting equally as a citizen in a free marketplace of ideas where you get to express your opinion as long as I get to in return. That's what America was founded on. And if we're not able to govern ourselves that way, I think that we've lost the essence of why we fought the American Revolution in the first place.
Let's talk a little bit about the relative responsibility, if you are going to have a rollback of administrative power, the relative responsibilities of the three branches. You've mentioned the importance of West Virginia versus EPA. But there's a limit to what courts can do, right? Like I remember sometime in the late 90s, Richard Epstein, my old law professor, was excited about the court's Lopez decision on the commerce power, and he wrote something to the effect of, we've got Justice Thomas and just four more justices to go, and we can, repeal the New Deal. But it doesn't really work that way, right? Like 5 votes can't, you can't do anything and everything with 5 votes. At a certain point, the court runs up against its limits. You've got the executive branch has the guns, the Congress has the money, and the court has its moral authority. So as important as these decisions have been, and they have the major questions doctrine has stopped a few administrative state abuses, but what do you see as the role of Congress in reining in bureaucratic power?
I see the role of Congress as important, but I'm not optimistic about it happening. The reality is the administrative state was the alibi for Congress. So this is exactly the existence of these bureaucrats who are responsible for writing these rules is perfectly the way that people in Congress, including Republicans, especially Republicans in some cases, get to rail about outcomes that they're actually accountable for, but it gives them the ultimate boogeyman. It's a real boogeyman, but a boogeyman nonetheless to go after, and that's actually a convenience for them. So do I expect that same Congress to say, no, we're going to shut down those agencies and reclaim that power that's going to do what? Give us political accountability again to our voters? No, I don't, because it's actually a oddly symbiotic relationship between the administrative state, which would rather wield the power, and the elected representatives whose culture has become one of not actually wishing to wield the power, but wishing to actually complain about outcomes that they ultimately don't have to claim responsibility for. So do I think Congress should be focused on reappropriating the power of the purse and the power to write rules in this country? I do. Am I optimistic that's going to happen? No, I'm not. However, that's why I think the Supreme Court cases of the last 4 years are vital, is that it creates the possibility for reform within the executive branch itself. So to your point that, okay, well, we only got those 4 justices or 5 justices for so long, I think we have more than the toolkit we now need. There's a little bit of a paradox. If you open up the pages of the New York Times on a given day, and they talk about the goals of firing large numbers of federal bureaucrats, they'll describe that. They describe me as somebody who would govern the country as an executive by fiat. That's interesting because my principal complaint is actually an overreach of executive branch power in the first place. Right? The executive branch should not be responsible for making laws. The executive branch is responsible exclusively for enforcing the laws already passed by Congress. So when the executive branch, including a U.S. president, takes the power back from the agencies that sit under him, that is actually a restraint, not an expansion of executive power itself. I come from the private sector, as you mentioned. The way I look at this is if somebody works for you and you can't fire them, that means they don't work for you. In some sense, it means that you work for them because you're responsible for what they do without having any authority to actually change it. So what does this reform look like? I mean, let's be tangible. I think it turns out that the U.S. president, novel idea, just as the CEO of a company has over his company, the U.S. president has authority to decide who is or is not hired in the executive branch. Now, the main objection to this is that there are so-called civil service protections. Okay, these are supposedly protections that stop an executive from being able to unilaterally fire somebody who is part of a federal employee union or has special employee protections in the bureaucracy. You got to read the rules carefully. Those employee protections protect against individual firings. They do not protect against mass layoffs. And mass firings are absolutely what we require to fix the Washington, D.C. bureaucracy. If you had a president who came in on day one, said something to the effect of, treat it as a thought experiment for now. If your social security number ends in an odd number, you're out. If it ends in an even number, you're in. Now, round 2. If your social security number starts in an even number, you're out. And if it starts in an odd number, you're in. That's a 75% mass headcount reduction across the bureaucracy which is completely compliant with the civil service protections because they do not protect against mass reductions in force. There's no litigation for disparate impact on race or gender or political belief. There's no retaliatory suits. There's no civil service claims. Those are mass reductions in force. That's existing legal authority, but which has been further bolstered by the Supreme Court backdrop that we currently have. You could imagine the executive coming in at the same time, could have a rational basis for that 75% headcount reduction. Here'd be one basis for getting there. So West Virginia versus EPA basically says that if Congress didn't actually write the law, if it pertains to a major policy question, the agency can't write that rule into existence, or it's unconstitutional. In that case, it dealt with some rules of the EPA that applied to the coal industry. Well, if you believe those rules applying to the coal industry were unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court laid out why, it was on the order of an impact of $2,000 per person that was affected. If that was a major policy question that was so big in its impact that Congress had to pass it rather than the agency, that quite literally means that most federal regulations today on the books, I don't mean that in some hyperbolic sense, I mean it in a literal sense, an overwhelming majority of current federal regulations are actually unconstitutional. So you could structure it different ways, but imagine you got somebody at the White House or somebody at the central, maybe it's the Office of OMB Director, OIRA Director, a new position, whatever it is, has an embed in every administrative agency. It's a constitutional law expert that says, here are the regulations that have been passed. Here's the major questions doctrine test from West Virginia versus EPA. Measure one versus the other. That's 75% of regulations right there. Now, if you've gotten rid of 75% of regulations on day one by executive order, saying that actually we've exercised too much executive authority, but instead we need to constrain the scope of those regulations, well, then now you have a rational basis to say I don't need 75% of the head count either. So that's a basis for a mass headcount reduction, just as you'd see at a company to say that it lost 75% of its revenue or is making 75% fewer products, you need 75% fewer people. Well, the product of the regulatory state is regulations. If you've rescinded 75% of the regulations, not only is that a stimulus to the U.S. economy, it is a basis for permanently ridding ourselves of the cancer of the bureaucrats who gave us that regulatory state in the first place. This is what real reform looks like. I think this is Javier Milei on steroids. It's what we require in the United States if we're to regain our national soul. And I think we have the toolkit to do it. So I don't think the legal limitations are actually what stop us. I don't think Congress is what stops us. In some ways, Congress has become irrelevant to this entire process. The question is, do we have the spine and the fortitude to live through the short-term consequences of that type of mass reduction in the scale of the federal government? I believe we do. I hope we do. Our founding fathers did, I could tell you that. If they were walking around today, they would find the current state of lawmaking in D.C. unrecognizable. But the question is, do we have the same fortitude of spine, the intestinal fortitude of our founding fathers, of James Madison and George Washington? Do we have the fortitude today to undergo some of those short-term inconveniences? But I said in my speech, you can make that sacrifice if you know what you're actually sacrificing for. It's not just for a free economy. It's for a republic grounded in sovereignty in the first place.
You're going to make me do two things that I'm really disinclined to do, one of which is defend Congress, which is, I think everything you say about the shell game aspect of the administrative state is true. Congress gets credit for, it's two bites at the apple. It gets to take credit for a broad, high-minded statute, like protecting endangered species, and then it gets to rail against the bureaucrats when they fill in the details. But it did, the House did pass the Reins Act at least once. There has been movement towards national emergencies reform and framework statutes that, flip the default setting of American government back to the rules don't go into effect unless they're passed by Congress. It's clearly not enough, but there's been more movement in that direction than we've seen in a long time. The second thing I don't want to do is, throw a wrench into the idea of mass layoffs of bureaucrats, because it's an idea that sounds very attractive. But don't you run into, if your plan is to do much of this by executive fiat, don't you kind of run into a major questions type problem. For instance, it seems weird to say the president can't just declare a student loan jubilee and write off the massive amount of debt, because that's a major question that, that Congress clearly didn't pass this HEROES Act statute to allow him to do that. But then to say you can take something like, the Reorganization Act of 1977, and not only do some major layoffs, but get rid of the department or everybody who works in the department. Isn't there, by the same principle, Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes.
Yeah.
That act was probably not designed to let the president, shut down a couple of cabinet departments that Congress appropriated money for.
So great question. I'm going to 3 points there, a lot there across your 2 points. First is actually, let's talk about the issue of Congress and whether they've actually shown us what's possible with downsizing the administrative state. I think they have on accident. Take the federal shutdowns that we've had in the last several years, okay? Every time we've had a government shutdown, on the brink of those shutdowns in these budgetary discussions, you'll hear the histrionics from even the national security state, FBI, et cetera, about how our nation's going to really crumble before our very eyes if we cross the Rubicon of a government shutdown. And a couple of times we actually did. The brinksmanship went so far that we faced what they called a partial or even more than partial shutdown. I'll tell you, the sun still rose in the east and still set in the west. The fact of the matter is, I don't know a single American across the country that felt their life change in any meaningful way for the worse during those periods of so-called government shutdown than in the periods where the government was actually functioning, other than the fact that their tax bills are higher to actually subsidize it, and their constraints applied to their life are far more severe because of the regulatory state that's funded by those bureaucrats. And so I think that that's the best experiment we have, that even in a chaotic form of government shutdown, and we could do this in a much more organized way, that actually the nation managed to survive it just fine, and Congress has inadvertently managed to show us that. Now, to your second question about if you're going to do this through executive action, well, wouldn't it be just as bad for an executive to say, okay, well, you're going to go do this thing that Congress never authorized me to go do. Go write these regulations. Go hire 1,000 more people than we plan to hire. Aren't you opening the door to that by also saying that by executive fiat, I want to fire 1,000 more people and rescind a bunch of regulations? And the answer to that is no, because it's a good question. It is a one-way ratchet. Here's why. I think it's a one-way ratchet to abolish the department, in many cases, if it's a redundant department. But it is a separate ratchet to cause it to come back into existence, because the original relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch was one where the executive was asking for the permission to spend the money. That's the way the budgeting process used to work. It used to be like the equivalent of a CEO going to a board of directors and say, do I have permission to spend this money on this particular budget area or another? That's what the executive branch, the leader of the executive branch, the U.S. president, used to do with Congress. In fact, the appropriations used to even say as much. They used to submit draft appropriations language suggesting may. May was the operative word, that we may spend a particular amount of money. Now, that's devolved into a process by norm, and in some case even by statute, which has mandated the U.S. president to spend that money. So one of the fixes I look for is, there's some statutory fixes that could help. Get rid of the Impoundment Prevention Act of 1974, which says that, you know what, even if Congress has appropriated it, the executive doesn't have to actually spend it. Change the draft language that goes in many of these appropriations bills from shall to may, that makes it discretionary spending. So there are some legislative fixes that could make this easier. But the bottom line principle is, historically, when you measure against the process of how these funds are appropriated, it is a one-way ratchet to say you can't spend the money that hasn't been appropriated. But historically, you can choose to not spend the money just because it has been authorized. And there's a difference as well, and this is why I drew the distinction briefly in my speech between the two kinds of nanny state. One is the entitlement state, one is the regulatory state. In the case of the entitlement state, I don't think by executive fiat you can say that I'm not going to pay out this much welfare or Medicaid or whatever to the states. That's appropriated, non-discretionary spending. That's different from downsizing the other part of the nanny state, which is the regulatory state, which is the employee HR reserves that sit within the executive branch itself. And I think the law draws a distinction between programs that have actually been budgeted, checks that show up in people's mail. I think a lot of those should have work requirements attached to them. But you can't attach those work requirements automatically without going through Congress. But when you're talking about actually downsizing the scale of an individual bureaucracy, both by way of its headcount or even the elimination of redundant agencies, that is under existing law within the province of the executive. It's a debatable notion. Nothing I'm telling you is going to be without debate. If it were, it would have been done already. But I do think the current Supreme Court, maybe not the Supreme Court of 2005, but the current Supreme Court agrees with me on that if you read between the lines of the way they've handed down rulings from the cases we've talked about to others in recent years. And I think we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity. I think it's a once-in-a-century opportunity to actually permanently tame that regulatory state. And I think that's the first step towards the broader project of not just dismantling the regulatory state, but dismantling the nanny state as we know it. And that includes the entitlement state on top. But that's a harder nut to crack because you require hard legislation to do it before first showing that you could do it with the regulatory state, still show the country is just as fine as can be, and then you move on to the broader entitlement state after that.
We have about 12 minutes left. Let's open it up for some questions. We're going to take questions from the audience and online as well. Sir in the front row.
Thank you.
I think you wait for the microphone to show up. And I've almost forgot my obligatory DC caution. Say your name, any affiliation if you think it's relevant, and please make the question a question, not a speech, or we'll have to cut you off.
Thank you. David DeLugas, Parents USA. With respect to Congress appropriating funds, is it an issue, separation of powers, for Congress to tell the executive branch that it must spend it or that it must do anything? Would that not be an issue? Therefore, your point of shutting it down, that's up to the executive branch.
So I believe it is an issue, but it is an issue that is already, I believe, worked out. So we can get into a level of detail I wouldn't have otherwise gone into. The Office of Personnel Management, for example, it's like the HR bureaucracy within the federal government, like the HR department of your mega corporation that someone might work at. Who sets the rules governing OPM? The law is clear on this. The President of the United States sets the regulations governing OPM, and then OPM regulations apply across the different agencies. That's outside of the purview of Congress when it comes down to who's going to be fired or what the size or structure of that bureaucracy is going to be. I think, as much as I would love for the answer to be yes, I don't believe it is a separation of powers issue for Congress to say that there's a certain amount of money that gets paid out in Social Security or in Medicaid payments or in welfare payments. I don't like the existence of those policies. I would vote to significantly constrain and attach work requirements to most of the welfare state as we know it. But as much as I would love to end that by any means possible, I don't think that's a separation of powers issue. That was passed through the constitutionally ordained lawmaking process. But it's the fact that I recognize that also allows me to be consistent when I say that when you have a bunch of three-letter bureaucrats in the Department of Labor or the CFPB or the SEC or the FTC or the EPA or the God knows what, writing regulations that Congress did never pass, that is unconstitutional because it never went through that congressionally ordained lawmaking process. So that'd be my answer to your question, sir.
Ma'am, second row. I think you're supposed to come up here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Esther, and I'm a sophomore at the George Washington University. And I was just wondering, given the current state of public opinion and political climate, how politically feasible is this so-called slashing of the administrative state? And what are some next steps that not only should, but can be taken to, proceed with this slashing of the administrative state?
Yeah, so how politically feasible is it? I generally don't opine a ton on questions of political feasibility because I think they're circular, right? I think there are moments where you have leaders that respond to what the people want. I think there are moments that require a leader to show the people what they need. And I think we live in one of the moments where we require leaders who show the people what they actually need. We're seeing a little bit of that in Argentina. I think what Javier Milei has done, it's a much smaller country, much less complicated circumstances. But it's shown what's possible with cutting the unimaginable and actually, at least so far, showing results in a positive direction for people as a result. So I think we have a leadership vacuum on the right for leaders that are courageous enough, stubborn enough to explain that this is not an alternative to helping American workers and manufacturers. It's not a more important priority than supporting American workers and manufacturers. No, this is the way we support American workers and manufacturers, by unencumbering them from the regulatory state that holds them back. You'll hear debates on the right where, I'll give you an example of where this courage needs to manifest itself. A lot of times you feel like you're telling the audience what they want to hear if you say, if a bank got a bailout from the US Fed, well, we need to claw back executive pay and bonuses from the executives at that bank. Okay, I'm fine with that. I mean, that sounds reasonable enough. If you're going to get a bailout and the executive got paid out millions of dollars before they got the bailout or after they got the bailout, maybe some of that should be clawed back. But actually, the thing we really need to be in the business of preaching to the audience is that our Federal Reserve should not be in the business of bailing out banks in the first place. Neither should our Treasury Department. And by the way, if you want to go one step further, we got to put the Fed back in its place to restore a single mission of restoring dollar stability as its sole goal, rather than aiming for inflation and unemployment, which is the equivalent of trying to hit two targets with one arrow and badly missing on both. That, by the way, has been one of the greatest impediments to wage growth for workers across this country, because they've treated rising wages as a leading indicator of inflation, when in fact anybody who knows the first thing about the business cycle knows that wages are the last thing to go up in the business cycle. So what you have is a Federal Reserve that tightens monetary policy right into a downturn of the cycle, which gives us those boom-bust bailout cycles in the first place. And I think that we require conservative leadership that explains that these are not goals that are in tension with helping American workers. That's not a trade-off. This is exactly how we achieve that in the first place. So how politically feasible is it? I think it depends on the quality of leaders who we have, who are willing to take that risk at the highest levels. It's not going to be done through Congress. I think it's going to be done through a leader of the executive branch. I think it exists in all 50 states. The administrative state is not limited to the federal government. It is alive and well in each and every one of the 50 states of our union, but it is most alive and well right here in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. And I think it will be the governors and the president of this country that bear the responsibility for making what is necessary politically feasible.
We have a question from the online audience, courtesy of Lawrence.
So our first question from the online audience is from Mustafa. He asks, do you see a future for capitalist ideas in our democracy when reducing regulations and the scope of government is so unpopular? In Argentina, it took decades of decline and huge economic shocks for them to elect Milei. Will the American electorate ever support reigning in the administrative state? I
think we're at a hard yes on that. Yeah, I think the American electorate, I still believe this is part of our national identity. This is part of our sovereignty. So I said the old direction got the neoliberal materialism of just believing that it's about the size of an economic pie. And believe me, I like maximizing the size of that economic pie just as much as the next guy. But that was the whole failure of the ideology that resulted in this new conservative protectionist backlash that said, no, you got it wrong. But it's a new kind of materialism that focuses on advantaging certain types of sectors over others, a state-directed form of capitalism that resembles some of the methods of the left. And I think the way forward for our conservative movement is to make this actually about sovereignty. It's bigger than just about capitalism. It's about our own agency as individuals, that you're not just riding some tectonic plate of group identity or economic class identity, but that you are an individual when unencumbered who can achieve anything you want with your own hard work and commitment and dedication, and that you are free to speak your mind at every step of the way. That is the essence of the American dream. That is the essence of who we are as a country. So I'll put it this way in stronger terms. If the answer to that question is no, then I don't think we have a country left. I'll tell you why. I think that we celebrate our skin-deep attributes and our diversity. Right? We have a few different shades of melanin in the audience today. I brought one of them myself. So a couple of different genders, two of them if you ask me, right? And that's great. We're diverse. But so what is really my response to that, unless there is something greater that unites us across that diversity? Is there a greater thread that unites us across our diverse attributes as Americans? I believe there is, and I believe it is our commitment to self-governance. I believe it is our belief in individual sovereignty and agency and self-determination. But if you believe that there is no political consensus around taming the regulatory state is effectively the skeptical alternative that says, no, you can't be trusted to self-govern. That's what the regulatory state represents. If we no longer have political consensus around taming the size and scope of that, then I think not only do we lose an economy, not only do we lose our freedoms, we lose the very identity that binds us together as Americans in the first place. And you know what? I think that if Thomas Jefferson would have said no, I think we ought to say no as well. That's the standard I also apply to our current day political reality. So do I think Americans will rally behind that vision? You're darn right I do. But I think we need a better class of leaders to serve it up to them.
I think we have time for one more. Please make it a short and to the point one. Someone towards the back this time. Fellow over there.
Hi, Shane Saramet. Question about government spending. Next year's budget is scheduled to be 30% of GDP. As part of reigning in the administrative state, do you see any political will to truly make big cuts? Because we know on one side there's no talk about it, but even if Trump wins, there doesn't seem to be anyone in the NatCon's ears about big cuts being on the agenda. What's your perspective?
So, I'll give you sort of my normative view, what should be. You can talk about what will be and what should be. Well, what will be, we'll find out, first of all, who even wins the election in 80 days, right? You know, why be in the business of predicting this stuff when you got 2 months just to find out? But the deeper question is what should be. So I think what we're missing right now is, and I think it's a wide open opportunity for the Republican Party, to recraft a pro-capitalism, pro-freedom, pro-anti-regulatory state, pro-growth agenda. We're missing that right now. So is that going to require massive cuts? It absolutely is. Does that political consensus exist? Definitely doesn't exist in the Democratic Party. In the Democratic Party, you've got two wings. You've got the center left and you've got the far left, who disagree only in degree, not in kind, about the scale of government intervention that's required to advance the vision of the good. Okay, so you got a far left that believes that you require total government intervention. You got the center left, which believes you require some level of government intervention. That's the scope of debate on the left. The right's more interesting. It's a more interesting political milieu right now, because you have those who believe that we should use the levers of government to advance alternative ends to the left, versus, I think, an alternative strain, certainly among the grassroots in this country, that is absolutely in favor of getting in there and actually wrecking it. And I mean that in a good way, wrecking it for the better. And one of the reasons I think it's more feasible than it looks is this is relatively recent, right? We're about 250 years old, almost, as a country. It's been less than half of that we had a government that was as committed to the existence of this nanny state as we have come to assume is permanent today. And it's really post-FDR, but really post-LBJ. We're talking about a quarter of our national history. And the best evidence we have is that it has failed the very people who it was designed to supposedly help in the first place. So I think one of the things we can do a better job of to make this more mainstream in the Republican Party and therefore in the country is to explain that it's less about an adverse move against the very people who are the recipients of that entitlement state, but rather how that entitlement state has even failed the very people who it was supposed to, purported to have helped. Look at black family formation in the country. About 40% of black kids today are born into a single-parent household. That number was less than half of what it was about a little less than half a century ago. It's because you get what you pay for in terms of the incentives that you create. That hasn't been good for anybody, because that's the best predictor for whether or not you graduate from high school, whether or not you end up in poverty, whether or not you actually achieve a greater economic life for yourself than your parents did. This is, I think, actually the winning argument for our side, is we're actually going to help the very people who the regulatory state and the entitlement state purported to assist in the first place. And if we do, then I think we're going to find that political consensus in the Republican Party. And I'll close with this comment about making the prediction about where the puck is going. So what I said made Donald Trump such an alluring and interesting leader in 2016 is that he bucked the consensus of the time. He said on the debate stage in 2016 in that presidential campaign what nobody else was willing to say about topics like the Iraq War. Really has shaped the direction of the Republican Party as a result. The question now is, where's the puck going from here? And what I believe is, I think our conservative grassroots base across the country certainly is hungry for not bringing the chisel, but bringing the chainsaw. But what they're looking for is somebody who can actually wield it with conviction and with compassion in the first place, doing it not because we're against the people, but because we're actually for the people, for the very people who we seek to lead. And so if we do, then I'm convinced that not only is my prediction that this is going to be future direction of the conservative movement, my prediction is if we really are willing to once and for all take aim at that seemingly permanent federal nanny state, both the entitlement state and the regulatory state, then we don't have to be this nation in decline anymore that we've become. This loss of national pride and national self-confidence that we suffer doesn't have to stay this way. This is a solvable problem. But I think the choice is ultimately ours. And, I think Republicans, we've gotten into the habit of blaming somebody else for our failures in seeing this through. Republicans have talked about cutting the administrative state and the nanny state for a long time. We have a lot of blame to go around for reasons why it's difficult or who stopped us from doing it. But as I often share with my kids, right, or share with young people, the number one person who's most responsible for what you achieve in life is actually you. There are a lot of other factors that come into play, right? I'm not going to say you're the only factor that determines what you achieve in life. There's a lot of obstacles, external obstacles along the way. You will have the social debates of racial discrimination or natural ability or whatever. Fine, but the number one factor that's responsible for whether or not you achieve your goal is you. And I think the Republican Party's got to internalize that lesson too. The number one factor determining whether we're successful in achieving what we want for the country, which I believe should be shutting down the administrative state and the nanny state and the entitlement state, that falls on us. And if we seize that opportunity, and I believe it presents itself in so many ways, the public is there, the Supreme Court's there, now's our moment to do it, then I don't believe that we have to remain ancient Rome in the final turn of the empire, but instead a country whose best days can actually still be ahead of us. That's what I believe.
All right, thank you all for being here. A compassionate chainsaw.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.